The Moss Report is brought to you by Mycolife, makers of the world's best mushroom extracts, including the Moss Method mushroom formula, available exclusively at mycolife.us. Hello, healers. My name is Ben, and this is the Moss Report. I'm here today with my father, author and founder of the Moss Report, Dr. Ralph W. Moss. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning, Ben.
So today we're going to be talking about red wine and also peanuts, which I guess in some way are connected. I'm looking forward to hearing what the relationship is. I think they might go together well if you were sitting at a bar and having a glass of red wine and maybe having some peanuts at the bar as well.
They do go together nicely in terms of having a drink and having some noshables on the table. Mm-hmm. So that probably just coincidental that they share some chemical characteristics that are, common to both of them.
Okay, and so I'm assuming, of course, because this is the Moss Report, that we are talking about some properties of these two foods that relate to cancer. Is that right?
Correct. Yes, and to health and to other things of interest to our viewers, like longevity, how long people live, or general well-being. These things are usually studied together. I mean, the different benefits you could get from compounds like red wine or peanuts. Researchers don't usually just say, well, we're just going to strictly stick to cancer issues. So I assume that everybody's interested in what also might keep them from dying. That would be an admirable goal for any program.
Well, I think a lot of our listeners are going to be very pleased to hear anything positive about red wine in particular as it relates to longevity or fighting cancer.
Yeah.
So where does the research live on all of these things, and what can you share with us about how they might affect health or fighting cancer?
Well, let's go back a few decades and look at where all of this began, and that was with Ansel Keys, a very famous nutritionist back in the 1940s and 1950s, who did the 7-country study and looked at heart attack rates especially. That was his special interest, but also death rates in various countries. And he put forward the idea that countries where there was very low fat consumption had greater longevity. So this became extremely influential. And of course, it's been modified and changed over the years. But the big exception and the big problem with his theory was that when they looked at different countries, it seemed to be true. But when they looked at France, it blew the whole study out of the water, really. Because if you add France into the equation, the French, at least at that time, ate enormously more saturated fat than Americans or people in other countries, and yet they had far lower heart disease, especially, and the longevity was good, and the cancer rates were good.
That it related to wine in some way.
So initially, it didn't make any sense, right, to blame fat, and I think that this fat phobia thing has gone as far as it's ever going to go, and it's really kind of turning back on itself and being rejected now widely. But then people started to say, well, what was it in the French lifestyle or the French diet that led to this greatly decreased heart attack rate and cardiovascular disease rate? And there were various things. I mean, I don't think it was frog's legs. I think it was
or snails.
Or snails. It was more and more people started to look at the wine. And then this eventually coincided with a great deal of interest in a compound called resveratrol. Not reversatrol, as some people say, where the letters are kind of transposed in that case, resveratrol. And it's similar to other things we've discussed, you and I, and I've written about, which are the polyphenols, the compounds in green tea, compounds in olive oil. In other words, these healthy chemicals that oftentimes have an entirely different function in the plant that they are derived from but in humans seems to provide benefits but are not necessarily related to why these compounds evolved over millennia and eons of time. And a lot of the interest then focused on resveratrol and grapes, particularly red wine rather than white wine or rosé wine, because there's, relatively speaking, a lot of resveratrol in the grape and especially the skins of the grapes. When I say a lot, though, and this is going to be a big part of the reason scientists have trouble accepting some of what we're saying, is that a lot in terms of wine or any other food is actually very little if you look at it in absolute terms. Mm-hmm. So when we say it's a good source of resveratrol, it's nothing like the amount that you get from a food supplement. Okay. But the reason for that is because the food supplement is almost always is derived from a plant that's never, to my knowledge, eaten and that you wouldn't want to eat, which is Japanese knotweed.
Okay.
So when you see a nice bottle of natural resveratrol, look closely at the label, because I've never seen, almost never see one that's actually derived from grapes or grape skins.
That's interesting. Knotweed has a lot of resveratrol in it.
It has so much so that it became the world standard for creating supplements of resveratrol.
The only thing I know about knotweed really is that it's very hard to get rid of it if it's growing in your garden or around, where you live, because it's so prolific.
Right.
And it's invasive, I guess, an invasive species here in the United States anyway.
Yeah.
Very difficult to get rid of that plant, and it grows like wildfire.
Like crazy. And in fact, most of the shrubbery in Ireland, and I just think Ireland because I've spent time there, and I know that this is a case, that it's infesting a lot of the shrubbery there, and it's, as you say, it's like bamboo. I mean,
it
just
is a lot
grows
like bamboo,
like crazy. So it's almost like a giveaway product. I mean, you know, the raw material is dirt cheap.
Sure.
Whereas try to extract resveratrol from grapes and grape skins, I mean, that's going to cost you. It's much more costly. Although some of the grape skins and seeds are a byproduct of the wine industry or the grape juice industry, so there is a source of it, but it's just not economical to do that. I have a problem with this because twofold. One is, who knows what else is in the knotweed, that you might be ingesting, and even if it's purified, what is the effect of taking 1,000 times more of a substance, which is not unrealistic, than taking the actual thing that people have been drinking and eating for thousands of years?
I think that's an interesting point, that where foods provide certain quantities, in a way, maybe you're overdosing by taking supplements of some of these things.
Right.
And they might not have the same effect as almost what you might call a homeopathic dose that you would be delivered in a food.
Right. And I think scientists feel like, well, they have to reproduce the exact amount that was used. The more is better, sort of. And we want to find out what resveratrol does to an animal or to a person. We'll just give it this huge amount, and that's going to be the most effective.
Right.
But, and you mentioned homeopathy, which is a whole medical philosophy, right, dating back to the 18th century, and oftentimes uses small, very small doses sometimes that are so small they're infinitesimal in terms of, the actual content. But I took a different tack on this once, and I was writing on this question, and that was to look at substances that science would agree are effective at extremely low doses.
Okay.
And I don't have that paper or that article in front of me, but things like anthrax. Remember the anthrax scare, probably
Sure.
from 25 years ago. Tiny amounts, and there are things other poisons that operate at extremely low levels. Another one that comes to mind is Agent Orange, which we don't hear so much about anymore, but that was part of the defoliation program that the U.S. launched in Vietnam during the Vietnam War.
Hmm.
Tiny amounts of Agent Orange and
Right.
of the poisons could interfere with reproduction and so forth.
Well, if I
So
can add another one in there,
go ahead.
there are psychoactive chemicals like LSD that can be taken in minuscule quantities that have profound impacts on the psyche, among other things. So,
Absolutely.
I don't think it's very far-fetched that small amounts of chemicals can have significant effects.
No, but yet, if you look at the scientific papers on resveratrol and the discussion generally by scientists, the general impression you get is, well, the amount of resveratrol in red wine is too small to have a major effect on the body. This is the general, I would say, general consensus. And there are experiments to show that at the level, there's a decreasing effectiveness and so forth, but they don't usually go down into the very tiny pico or range and below. So I think we have to keep an open mind about it.
Hmm. And is that what we're talking about in terms of quantities of resveratrol in red wine, for example? Those type of minuscule amounts? It's got to be more than that, though, right?
It is more, but it's in the range of a few milligrams per glass, let's say, of wine. Which,
Well, I want to bring up one more thing before
yeah,
you start telling us more about the science of this, and that is that we've talked about at length the nature of synergy in foods and how at times when certain substances or molecules are extracted or isolated and then given in large quantities, as you've discussed, you can lose out on the synergistic properties of the multiple different kinds of molecules that are at play in the whole food.
absolutely. So the food itself, I'm forgetting the exact number, but there's hundreds of compounds in like in red wine. It's a very
Right.
complex food, and limited research is done on the interaction of these different compounds. I think the net result is a general healthier person. Although I'm sure we'll talk about this. Is red wine healthy or not?
Right.
I believe it is, but
Okay.
but you have to hedge this around with with all the caveats, et cetera, et cetera. But the other what I thought you were going to talk about was the synergy between, let's say, the red wine and the steak that you're eating, or the red wine and the asparagus, or whatever makes up the meal.
Right.
Because we don't usually, unless you're an alcoholic, you're not going to just limit yourself to drinking red wine. You're going to probably eat something with that. And the French certainly do. They've raised that to a fine art.
Sure.
And in my book, The Moss Method, I think I stopped at about 50 discussing 50 different scientific papers that show synergy among the main antioxidants or the main nutritional factors. Another thing that we were talking about before, Ben, was like, how did resveratrol get into a high position in terms of the Moss method, as I discuss it in my book?
Right.
The reason really was that I was looking for compounds, natural compounds, that kill or block cancer stem cells because of my emphasis on the importance of this category of cancer stem cells in terms of the recurrence of cancer and also the persistence of the disease after seemingly effective treatment. It's
Right.
one of the tragedies of cancer treatment is that sometimes when you think you're done with it, you're not really done with it. And
Right.
it used to be, you live 5 years and then you're done with it. Well, we know of cases where people live 10 or 20. I even once consulted for a woman who had lived 40 years without breast cancer and then had a recurrence of the same breast cancer 40 years later. So there's something mysterious about this whole process of how cancer and why cancer grows. And since about 20 years ago, scientists have identified special cells within a tumor in almost every kind of cancer they've looked at called cancer stem cells.
Right.
There were one or two drugs that have been proposed for repurposing, reusing them in a different context from what they originally were developed for. And these drugs are toxic, expensive. They haven't worked their way all the way through the FDA process. But parallel to that, there's been a great deal of research done on natural agents. And we know exactly when and where that began. It started at the University of Michigan. Max Wicha, who was the head of the cancer center there, was the senior author on the paper. And in fact, I've even found a paper from the National Cancer Institute predating that by a couple of years. So around the year 2000, and I think it was 2003, scientists started to think, well, if we're having such trouble finding drugs that'll kill cancer stem cells, maybe some of these natural agents, either foods or supplements that you buy in a health food store, maybe they would work. And lo and behold, they do. So, but the commercial world, the world that's oriented towards the maximum profit, especially drugs, couldn't really buy into that because these are too low priced and too readily available, and they're kind of associated with some people call quackery. So, it was a kind of no-go to really go much further into that, although there are a couple of hundred papers in the U.S. government database, PubMed, that do point in the direction of the natural agents being effective at killing cancer stem cells.
Okay. And some of those have to do with this
Resveratrol.
compound?
Correct.
Resveratrol.
So the main ones would be resveratrol, soy isoflavones like genistein, sulforaphane from broccoli and especially broccoli and radish sprouts, curcumin from the turmeric root, and then
Genistein.
genistein would be the soy.
Okay.
Yeah, and then
Apigenin.
yeah, from the
Parsley.
parsley. But
Right.
also very important would be EGCG from green tea, and the various polyphenols or polyphenols, depending on how you want to pronounce it.
And there are a few
from
more,
from
I think,
olive oil
in the book as well.
Oh
Right.
yeah, so there's about 20
Okay.
in the book, and 10 I put in the highest category. So I then, when looking for synergy between those various substances, because I think a synergy means greater than additive effect, meaning that if you get 10 units from one and 15 from another, you'd expect to get 25 benefit. I'm making these numbers up,
Right.
but you get 50 because they boosted each other. That's synergy. And this is, I stopped counting at about 50 papers because, it's almost like wherever you look in the natural world, you're finding these links. And I think this is very important.
Talking about laboratory studies of these natural compounds or combinations of the natural compounds,
Right.
specifically versus cancer stem cells.
Not always, but sometimes, yes. But I think this principle of synergy is central to what we're talking about. And it's central to the Morse method.
Okay. So that comes back to what I was saying about the synergy of the molecules within the individual plant.
Right.
So there's that. And then also the synergy of these compounds in combination with other foods that have their own set of properties and compounds associated with them.
Right.
Where the cumulative effect is greater than the individual components.
Right, exactly. And we're sort of counting on that, because otherwise you think, well, we get good results with one and good results with another. But when you look at the combination, sometimes it's startling how much you've increased the effectiveness. But yes, I mean, I guess a lot of this is cell line research, cancer cells that are taken from originally from a patient and then grown in the laboratory. These are artifacts in a way of the whole process of, the war on cancer, but they're usually predictive of what's going to happen in humans. Not always, but there are no drugs approved without a scaffolding of laboratory testing. So,
Right.
and we have to make choices about our food anyway. We can't be entirely agnostic about whether something works or not, because we're always making choices. Most of us, sensible people, will make choices based on what the health implications are of what we do. And there's so many arrows pointing in this direction from so many different studies that I don't think it's at all outlandish to say, since we're going to make choices in terms of our food, we might as well choose the ones that science has shown have an effect in terms of blocking and killing cancer stem cells.
Well, I also think that there's a kind of something to do with the evolution of human beings.
Yeah.
And the foods that we've eaten historically that then we've maybe evolved to also utilize better through the natural process. And I think red wine in particular, goes back, I can't even know how many thousands of years.
Yeah.
So I think it might be fair to say that humans have a very deep and connected relationship to that particular food product. It's not some Johnny come lately.
Right. Right. And there's plenty of Johnny come latelys on the internet and elsewhere, people trying to sell you miracle cures of various kinds. But I'd say as much as possible, go back to the old standbys.
And olive oil being another one.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great that these products that we've had in our diets for thousands of years have now been shown in scientific research to have really good healthy properties, and they're not just things that we were attracted to because they tasted good, or maybe that's why we were attracted to them in the first place, but the body changes over, the millennia.
Right. And in terms of evolution, one of the really interesting things about resveratrol is that the content of resveratrol is much higher in grapes that have thick skins and grow in cool climates. So why would that be? Well, people have, scientists have sort of sussed this out, and what they have in common is that these grapes are very prone to fungal growth on them.
Grapes in general are?
Yes, but these grapes in particular, because of the growing conditions,
Okay.
in coastal areas that are subject to cool climates and moist conditions, they're more prone. Grapes growing in that area would be more prone to mold.
I see where you're going. So the plant itself has developed its own resistance
Right.
to being infected,
Yes.
let's just say,
Yes.
and getting disease
Right.
by creating its own internal mechanisms through some chemical. Yeah, that tracks.
And that's resveratrol.
Interesting.
So now when we make wines out of those strains of grapes that grow well in those conditions, or from vineyards that are in those areas, you see more resveratrol.
I wonder, can I
go ahead.
ask, so in other discussions we've had, we've talked about the colors of some of these plant chemicals
Yeah.
and how, in a way, the pigment of the plants is directly related to the compounds that we're studying
Yeah.
or that we're discussing. So in this case, is resveratrol tied to the pigmentation of the plant?
It is. It is. I'm not sure that it's the resveratrol that's giving it the color, but it is associated with a deeper, darker red color.
Okay.
And the areas, we'll get into this in a minute. I mean, what types of wine have the most resveratrol? And they generally, from my understanding, are areas that fulfill all these requirements of being cool, growing by water, being prone to mold, and so forth. The very few studies, by the way, that compare the resveratrol content of various brands or types of wine. In fact, the only one that I'm aware of, and maybe I've missed something, but I've looked many times for this, but the only one I'm aware of is a study that was done at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, which is adjacent to a big wine growing area called the Finger Lakes. Mm-hmm. It's a lovely, lovely area in upstate New York.
That's where you had your honeymoon, wasn't it?
No.
Okay.
we went to the Adirondacks. Yeah.
Okay.
The wasn't the Finger Lakes. It
Okay.
was a different lake system.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a whole nother story.
Okay.
But anyway, I have been up there within the last 10 years, and I visited the winery, which had the wine with the highest content of resveratrol in the United States.
How did you find that out?
So there was some publicity around this at the time that it came out, and I called the vineyard and I spoke to the son of the founder. It had been found. It was founded. This vineyard was founded right after World War II by an immigrant from Eastern Europe who had brought over certain samples, different kinds of vines with him, and was a real scholar of the whole process of creating wines. And they had a certain, like a biodynamic philosophy of more like organic growing and so forth. Mm-hmm. But anyway, they did this, and then a local agronomist at Cornell took samples, not just from them, but from other parts of the country, and quantified how much there was of the resveratrol, and they came out on top. And then I went up. I had some other business in Ithaca, and I went up there, but I made a side trip to go to the various vineyards, drinking my way across central New York. Not really, but it's tempting. Mm-hmm. But I hit that vineyard. I had a nice conversation. The gentleman I had spoken to had passed away in the interim, but I talked to his son, the grandson of the person who founded the vineyards, and we can. Are
they still in business? Do you know?
They are. We'll give a link.
Okay, good.
Yeah, but they came out the highest, and that was an area also adjacent to one of the Finger Lakes, and it fulfilled all the requirements. And yeah, their one particular product that they had that sort of blew away the competition. But unlike let's compare this now to olive oil, another very super healthy thing to include in your diet. So we know what it is, and we're looking for in the olive oil, these polyphenols, and there's a lot of competition among the various brands of olive oil over who's got the most of these polyphenols in the olive oil, and you also can taste those compounds. They give you a peculiar back of the throat tickle, slightly bitter, slightly painful. I'm sure you've experienced this.
Yes,
right?
I have.
and newbies to the field of olive oil ingestion might find that a little unpleasant, actually. I remember the first time that I tested it actually was with one of your daughters, and we went into a Greek specialty shop. It was in Providence, Rhode Island, as a matter of fact, and they were having a olive oil tasting in the back of the shop. And man, I was like blown away. Like, I'm supposed to like this, But you can, now that I'm so much more enlightened, I always taste and test the olive oil whenever I buy it, and I can pretty much predict how much polyphenols there are in that sample. So I buy a small amount, and then I'll taste it. And if it gives me that tickle, pain, whatever you want to call it, then I say, yeah, well, this is a potent product. You can't really do that so much with the red wines. A little bit you can. You can predict based on the type of wine it is.
And nobody's putting that statistic on a label or anything.
Correct. I haven't, not a one.
Some of these olive oils do include the polyphenol
Absolutely.
quantities, but not all of them.
Not at all. But there's a specialty market for people who are hip to the olive oil benefits.
Right.
Yeah. So you could call the company.
Uh-huh.
The olive oil industry requires them to do the testing, certificate of authenticity for the olive oils.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that includes the number associated with the amount of polyphenols.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But not so much in the wine industry. They're
No.
not required to test for the quantities of resveratrol and report that. So you could
Right.
call a vineyard and ask them, and they might not have any idea.
Right. And only that one vineyard that I'm aware of ever made a point of it, and it isn't generally known among consumers. People aren't they're not focused on it. Whereas the Europeans, in particular, are very focused on the health benefits of olive oil.
Right.
And actually, the oil industry in Spain sponsored the big clinical trial that was done with Spanish olive oil, which has generally a high content of these polyphenols.
Okay.
And the results were very, very positive, and we talk about that in the Moss method. But
And our other podcast, which we'll link to, I think I should
Right.
point or something, there's...
right.
So this study from Cornell, where they did that comparison
Yeah.
of the different varieties of wine and identified which ones had the most of these resveratrol compounds in them, is that the only source of information that we have about the varieties that contain the resveratrol, or is it something
No.
else that keeps up to date with that?
That information is out there, and I have accessed that. The types of wine and what their average content is, resveratrol content, is available. It's just not when you get down to the specifics. And of course, it's going to vary by vintage. It's going to vary by the type of wine. It doesn't mean every wine from that vineyard is going to have that, and so forth.
Well, that actually brings me to a question that I was just thinking about, which is that with the olive oil, we discussed that the freshness of the olive oil makes a big difference
Right.
in terms of the quantity of polyphenols that are contained in it. But when we talk about red wine, oftentimes we do talk about vintages that are, several years old or whatever they are. I mean, I think red wine is prized for getting better as it ages, at least in many cases.
Right.
So how does that affect, if you know, the quantity or quality of the resveratrol in the wine?
Yeah. My understanding is that this contradicts the way people usually shop for red wine, in the sense that older is not necessarily better, that actually you want to choose a more recent vintage.
That's good to know.
And I mean, age-wise, most of the wines that I drink, I'm not, obviously not wealthy, and I'm not a true connoisseur of wine, so I'm not choosing the 10-year, 15 or 30-year-old wines. I'm choosing fairly recent wines. It's nice if you get one that's a few years old, but most of the wines that you see on the shelf are a couple of years old. Now, those might be better for you, resveratrol-wise, than a very highly aged one. But the aged one might have developed other compounds that would be also desirable. So I'm not saying not to drink the older ones, but it isn't necessarily better for you. The more recent vintages might be.
So we've recently celebrated the wedding of the former producer of the Moss Report podcast, my daughter Rachel, and she married someone who is in the wine business, I guess you'd say. He's a sommelier, and he, among other things, has given us presentations on different wine varieties and their qualities and so forth. And we've talked about vintages and areas that their wine is grown in. We didn't talk specifically about resveratrol, but I wonder if there is a relationship, though, about some of these other compounds that change in a wine over time. And I believe, if I remember correctly, there's something called tannins that are, I guess, add a bitterness or can be an unpleasant flavor
Yeah.
that dissipate over time. And I'm sure that there's got to be some connection with the ways that these compounds evolve. And maybe the lack of bitterness might also include something to do with the resveratrol. I'm speculating, of course.
Yeah, I haven't come across that. I thought you were going somewhere else with this, though, which is that he has a special interest in Argentine wines.
Yes,
and
that's true.
and the outstanding or commercially outstanding Argentine wine is Malbec.
Right,
And if I can do my little show and tell here,
of course.
okay, I went on a little bit of a shopping spree. Poor me.
Oh,
Okay, so I hit the main stores, that like
okay.
Trader Joe, because that's where
All
I
right.
shop.
And we're going to just preface this. None of these are sponsored.
No, not sponsored. Nor do I have any connection to Trader Joe's or
Okay.
Costco. And I never remember where I got these guys, but this is a nice bottle.
Hold it still, Dad. Let me
All
see.
right.
Okay, there you go. Okay.
So
Malbec
this is
2023. All right.
right, which is now a couple of years old, coming from the Valle de Uco. And anyway, and I also look at Vivino to see what other people are saying about this app called Vivino,
Right.
and how they rate it and so forth.
Right.
So I'm a savvy wine shopper, but this would be, if I like this wine, this type of wine would be one of my go-to wines.
Okay.
Because Malbec, we know that as a type of wine, and it coming from Argentina, and it's very reasonably priced. These are real bargains, these Malbecs, if you like Malbec. But this is
I do.
yeah, I do too. It's a wine that has you have a better chance of getting a relatively better amount of resveratrol from this. And then while I'm at it, I'll show you what else I picked up.
Sure.
From American wines.
Okay.
And this is Flying Arrow Pinot Noir.
You have to move it more
Yeah,
centrally.
yeah, I'll do that.
Okay. Good. Pinot
So
Noir.
the Pinot
2020
Noir,
2022.
yeah. So that's
Okay.
a 3-year-old wine,
All
and
right.
again, I'm just going by Vivino.
All right.
Well rated, well ranked. This one's coming from Pinot Noir North Coast, the California.
Okay.
So Pinot Noir is, of course,
So these are popular varieties,
very
Malbec and
right.
Pinot Noir.
There are two varieties that are from Chile that seemingly have the highest amount of commercially available resveratrol. I haven't found them. I have a specialty. I have a specialty wine shop in my town,
Okay.
and I was going to go in there and talk to them. Maybe they could special order it for me.
All right.
But Pinot, if you're just in the supermarket and you have a
Right.
limited supply, and the famous area for growing Pinot is Oregon. Again, a kind of a moist, cold, hot, cold
Sure.
climate. That's the really famous part. But increasingly, California, Washington, other similar climates, they're not as famous for being Pinot areas, but they're probably good.
And the study that you referenced where they did the comparison,
Yeah.
were those varieties sort of listed out from, top to bottom in terms of the greatest
I believe
quantities of resveratrol?
I believe they were, Ben. I'd have to go back and look
Okay.
at it. Yeah,
Yeah, if you'll send me the link,
I
we'll
will.
include that in
Right,
the description.
right. At that time, I mean, Pinot was just becoming very popular. I think that movie Sideways with Paul Giamatti was one of the things that led to the popularity of Pinot.
I have to see that.
So, yeah, great movie. So there's that. Let me get the other.
Oh, there's more.
Oh yeah, yeah. I went to. I
You
went
really
to,
did your research.
the research will come later.
These are unopened bottles, I see.
Right, right. I'm not a great drinker, actually. So, and here's another. This was another Pinot from Napa Valley, which is, again, not an area you think of
Kirkland, that's
Yeah.
the Costco brand.
This is the Costco brand.
Right.
I think this was like $7.
That's good.
I'll
Good
say.
value.
I'll say. Yeah, whether it's any good or not, I don't.
Okay, so now I have to ask some questions. Okay, are there more?
One more.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, yeah. Get me
You wrote
going.
it down.
Yeah. So this is from Trader Joe's, and it's Moon X.
Oh.
It's the red wine conglomerate. It's a mixture. It's a mixture. And I believe I'd have to show you my research on this, but I believe that this contains some of the wines. I guess the reason these things are inexpensive is because they can put whatever they want that's red in a mixture. But some of it contains Syrah, some of it contains different kind of grapes that are known to have considerable amount of resveratrol. So I have no guarantee that that's going to be the case, but I probably enjoy drinking it and could get a little bit.
Let's say, for example, if you were dealing with cancer or trying to prevent cancer or recurrence of cancer and wanted to take some red wine to get the resveratrol, I'm assuming that it wouldn't be in such quantities that would be debilitating that you would recommend.
Right.
Well, you probably have a glass a day, maybe with dinner, perhaps.
Right. I think that is a very good prescription.
Okay. So you found some positive studies against cancer in the laboratory, but I understand not all of them were positive. Is that right?
Right. It really came to a fore because of one lab at Harvard by a tenured professor, Sinclair, at Harvard, who discovered this substance called sirtuin, SIRTUIN, which he said was stimulated by resveratrol, and it led to an increase in longevity in at least 3 different species, starting with very worms or something, and then working up to mice. There was, I think, a 15% increase in longevity, and it mimicked the effects of calorie restriction. So we've known since the work of Tannenbaum in the 1940s at Reese Hospital in Chicago that restricting calories to animals led to them living longer. This is a well-known fact in science, and also decreased cancer and so forth. So there were many health benefits to calorie restriction, just limiting the intake. But in humans, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but this is a well-known principle. So they found something that seemed to say, the early studies in the 1980s and 90s seemed to be implying that resveratrol would lead to increased longevity. So it kind of gave a boost to the French paradox.
Okay. And were there any studies that showed something in a less favorable light?
Right. So it worked, and the fact that it was coming out of Harvard by a tenured lab professor who still works on this general topic, by the way, there was enormous amount of excitement about this, and he even founded or helped to found a company that was exploring these different compounds, these sirtuin boosters. But and a drug company, I think it was Pfizer, got involved in this, but they never were able to show just with that agent alone, strong effects in humans. There was some positive effects on like metabolism and blood chemistry and so forth. It wasn't like it was nothing, but it didn't seem to be in line with what happened in the animals. So it wasn't a complete negation of it. It was just like, we got to go back to the drawing boards and figure out exactly what's going on. And they've been at the drawing board stage now for a couple of decades. And
Yeah. Okay. Well, that doesn't sound so bad in
no,
terms of if it doesn't have if some study didn't show a positive effect, that's not the same as, oh, it's got some, deleterious effect.
but the way Wall Street works, the way which is the way the market works, is that people, both individually and also in terms of their investment, they're looking for some magic bullet. And we've seen this over and over and over again. It's happening now with the GLP-1 drugs, anti-diabetes and weight loss. Now suddenly we're hearing about, the other shoe is dropping, and we're hearing about side effects, serious ones associated with that. So it is just sort of human nature in a way that people get super excited about something, and that's boosted by the people who are, invested literally in the product, and then it becomes always more complicated. So I'd say I wasn't surprised, and I'm not dismayed by the so-called negative studies, because I think it just sort of brought things down to earth by the inevitable inflation and the deflation of people's hopes around this. I'm not looking for magic bullets.
And by negative, you say that's just not positive.
Right, exactly. Well, it should be a different word, right? I mean, we don't mean negative, but
No.
it didn't fulfill the expectation that they found the fountain, Ponce de Leon fountain of youth, in grape juice. It's always things more complicated than that. But again, how I will relate this back to my book, The Moss Method, I'm not relying on resveratrol to do anything alone as a standalone substance. First of all, what are we trying to accomplish? In cancer, we have good methods for eliminating, killing bulky tumors and for many kinds of cancer. What we don't have is a way to stop the insidious progression and recurrence of the disease after the treatment. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. So what's happening in those cases where it's not working, where the cancer recurs against all expectations? I think the most logical and well-founded explanation for that is the persistence of cancer stem cells, this special category of supermalignant cells that direct the whole process, like generals direct an army. And science's inability so far, conventional science, conventional oncology, to come up with agents that specifically target cancer stem cells. So I think that's where we should be putting more of our effort. The second thing is we know that there are natural compounds that do a good job at targeting cancer stem cells, at the markers of cancer stem cells. And the third thing is the general principle that these natural compounds synergize with each other. Their effects are more than additive. So therefore, making a smoothie, if you use a good quality soy milk, which we've discussed in the past, along with a resveratrol, or along with the polyphenols, along with matcha tea, or whatever you're going to put in that healthy smoothie, you're going to get a super additive boost of the anti-cancer stem cell effect of those compounds. And it will pass muster with 99% of oncologists who are thinking about this, and who, if you present this to them, very few will object. When you get into the realm of supplements, however, like where you're taking in 1,000 times more resveratrol than you would get from a glass of wine, then I think all bets are off, because we don't really know in any sense what the effect of that would be. And the possibility for harm is consequently greater. whereas the possibility of harm, I mean, the possible harm from a glass of wine are already filtered into the equation.
We also we're going to talk about an unrelated foodstuff, namely peanuts.
Yeah.
Now, before you get into it, I want to say I want to just speak to our audience for a moment and thank you for making the Peanuts, or rather our Nuts podcast, one of our most popular podcasts. I believe it's coming up on almost 500,000 views, which is amazing and very rewarding for us to feel like it's provided value and people are interested in that subject. And there were a lot, over 1,000 comments on that particular podcast video. And a lot of people had a lot of questions. In particular, I guess some people didn't watch the video all the way through, where we said we know that peanuts are not a nut. I'm going to start out by saying it's a legume, in other words,
Yeah.
a pea or bean,
Yeah.
and not a tree nut. Yes, we know that. But also, people expressed that there were pretty significant concerns about nuts, tree nuts, containing compounds that many people have said could potentially be unhealthy, and also with peanuts having different things that are problematic. We know that peanuts and peanut allergies are a real thing and that they affect a certain percentage of the population. And putting that topic aside, there are other concerns. But before we get into those concerns and answer some of those questions, why don't you start by telling us what you have found about peanuts that makes them related to this conversation?
So peanuts are, I think, the second biggest source of resveratrol, other than the wines and the grapes. They're certainly well up there. That doesn't mean they have a lot, but they do have some. So it isn't a strong second place. It's not a contender for a substitution, but it's also adding to the amount that you would get. And there's other beneficial things in peanuts, out of the beneficial compounds. But peanuts, look, I've probably read 100 papers on nuts and specifically about cancer, scientific papers. And I would say that out of that 100, maybe 2 or 3 are specifically about peanuts. And when you see the outstanding papers, the ones that come out of Harvard, Chan School of Public Health, and also from Imperial College in London, and all from the Scandinavian side, I mean, published in top journals, they all lump together peanuts with tree nuts. They know the difference. Come on, these are the world experts on the topic. They're not ignoring it. They just say that the chemical composition of, even though peanuts are a legume, and by the way, Brazil nuts are not considered nuts either. They're seeds. The definition of a tree nut is that it's a hardened seed or 2 seeds of a tree that are consumed, for sustenance. But the peanuts are very similar, even though they are a legume. They are similar in their chemical composition, and they're similar in their usage and so forth. So people don't always clearly differentiate between peanuts and nuts. As we know, when you get a mixture of planters or something, very, very often the peanuts are also almost dominant in that mixture.
Right. It doesn't say mixed nuts and beans. It says mixed nuts with the peanuts in it.
Right.
I heard you say that the peanuts wouldn't be a substitute for the red wine in terms of getting some resveratrol. But if you're not wanting to drink alcohol, is it a fair way to get some resveratrol into your diet?
Yes.
And then my other question is, what about just straight up grape juice?
It's almost as good as the wine.
Okay.
It's
Although we know it's also very sweet. It's
right. For me, it would be a prohibitive because of my blood sugar issues. Whereas wine, a dryish red wine would have about 1 gram of carbohydrate per ounce. So I can get by easily with 5 ounce glass of wine. Wine has other factors that interrelate with blood sugar, which we don't have to go into, but it's basically for the half the population that struggles with blood sugar issues in the U.S., wine is a bit safer from that point of view. But the peanuts, why not just say, well, people should eat tree nuts? Tree nuts are clearly of great health benefit. And all you need is a handful a day. In fact, when you start getting over an ounce, you're starting to have other issues, which is that they're fattening. So it may be counterproductive to have to go nuts with nuts. You
Right.
don't want to do that. But they're hard to stop eating, especially when they're salted, and the peanuts are that in spades. So yeah, there are issues, but peanuts. The reason you wouldn't want to exclude peanuts is that in the few studies that have been done, which really isolate the peanuts from the other tree nuts, there are some areas in which peanuts excel tree nuts. In the biggest study, and I think the most convincing study, the peanut consumption reduced strokes by 8%, which was more than the tree nuts did. The tree nuts excel in other health parameters. So I'd say if you're trying to work out a good, healthy diet, you should include some peanuts in that. And I do. I just keep nuts around in the house. I'm looking over at my dining room table, and there's raw walnuts on the table. We have them every day.
Okay.
Every day. I keep them out. I nosh on them. Your mother puts them in her oatmeal. We find ways to incorporate that. And I'm sort of subconsciously keeping track that I'm not overdoing it. And besides, walnuts, which I think are the healthiest nuts of all,
Okay.
you're not really tempted so much to overeat walnuts. First of all, they're not roasted; they're raw, which is good, and so I keep those out. And I have peanuts around also, and my body just seems to crave them, and I know they're there, and it's just a part of the unconscious health habits. But I make sure that I always get some every day, and I think that's a healthy thing to do.
All right. Well, this has been an interesting conversation. I hope it's been encouraging to folks out there that adding some red wine and some nice healthy nuts is a good way to enhance their diet to help stave off disease, in particular, fighting cancer. So is there anything else that you wanted to share with us before we wrap up?
Well, I'll give you a further updated report after I drink these 4 bottles. I got to do something with them now.
Well, I'll be right over.
We've had some wonderful times, by the way, in wine tastings, right? In the past. I mean, some things that are
Yes.
just very memorable. I even have the notes that I kept from that time that when your now son-in-law was over guiding us in a wine tasting, and I was talking to him at the wedding about how much I cherish that. I still have I look at this not infrequently, get some hints still about what to drink. So it's an incredibly fascinating, complicated story of the part of human history, and I wouldn't throw this away because some people have trouble handling it. It's a very, very among our most potent foods. So yeah, I mean, go easy with it. But I say if you can, you should continue to include some good red wines, high resveratrol wines, in your daily regimen.
Well, Elizabeth and I are going this coming July, to a health conference and a couple of clinic visits in and around Paris.
Okay.
So I'll keep that advice in mind
Good.
when we get there. All right. Well, thanks, Dad. Thanks for doing the research. Thanks for that good news.
Yeah.
And as always, for the Moss Report, I'm Ben Moss. How are you healing today?